Hi everyone. My apologies for the delay. I was dealing with a pretty intense family emergency yesterday and wasn't able to get a lot of sleep, so please bear with me, but I wanted to get this in for us. I was the group leader for this week, and I will be discussing Chapter 8, Causes and Reasons, in the About Behaviorism book by B.F. Skinner. So he begins with talking about how people started thinking about our behavior and people actually started to become curious about why we were doing what we were doing. And then he goes into break down a bunch of different types of communication ways. So just some of the sections were commands, advice, and warnings, and then directions, instructions, folklore, maxims, and proverbs, then governmental and religious laws, and then the laws of science. So I'll just break down each of these a little bit. The commands, advice, and warnings is where he starts, and he says that these are some of the basic commands and probably some of the first ways people communicated, and just by telling someone to watch out gives them a warning so they can tell that something is going to be happening, or there could be a consequence if they were not to move out of the way, like from a falling rock, as he says. But commands are really where there is you can tell there's a serious consequence, and the person who's commanding the other person will make sure that the aversive consequence is known. And advice is the more positive between the other two, and this one actually just focuses on a behavior and implies a positive consequence. Directions and instructions, he expands on a little bit more, and so directions are more step by step, and a lot of times we think of this when it comes to maneuvering or driving a car. And his example of learning to drive and this becoming more instruction-based after a while, so you use the verbal directions at the beginning and then it becomes more of a instruction-based, and people develop those skills, so I thought that was kind of interesting. I did have a question here, and I'll post the questions actually in the discussion board so you'll be able to read them better. But on page 134, Skinner says, much of education is instruction in verbal behavior. The student is told how to use words rather than how to use an accelerator or brake. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this quote, because I'm personally a visual learner, so sometimes hearing verbal directions can be difficult, and that's how the education system is based on verbal directions. I'm curious what y'all's thoughts are on that. The next section, folklore, maxims, and proverbs. I struggled a little bit with this section, but it seemed like it was just kind of leading up into the governmental and religious laws, so if anyone has insight into folklore, maxims, and proverbs, that'd be awesome. But the next section, governmental and religious laws, when people began living together, there needed to be a standard, and this is how laws are basically developed, and he talks about how the contingencies became more powerful with breaking the laws and things. Like, I thought of murder, and I mean, unfortunately, when someone commits this act, the consequence is jail time or even the death penalty. So he's just focusing on how there are consequences to our actions, and some of them stem from governmental or religious laws. And then Skinner goes to talk about the laws of science and how these laws probably came about through craftsmen, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then he goes on to talk about his blacksmith example, where the blacksmith is trying to learn the best way to operate the bellow to keep the fire steady and hot. And so here Skinner talks about how the blacksmith's behavior was contingency shaped because he had to actually go through the trial and error of, I guess, trying whichever way worked best to keep the bellow, or whichever way worked for the bellow to keep the fire going at its best possible pace. And so the blacksmith created this chant, and that's how he eventually started to remember the best way for the bellow to work. And so then Skinner then continues the example by saying, since the apprentice just was given this chant and followed the rule, and he did not have to go through the process of figuring out how the bellow best worked with the fire, the apprentice's behavior is actually rule governed. And I thought this example made a lot of sense for me. And then after the chant was set into place, the blacksmith, even though his behavior was originally contingency shaped, once he started following his own chant and didn't have to test what the environment was going to do to him, he became rule governed as well. Skinner then just breaks down laws of science versus laws of religion and government, and he says laws of religion and government are made and codify contingencies of reinforcement maintained by social environments, and the laws of science are discovered and describe contingencies which prevail in the environment quite apart from any deliberate human action. And that he talks about that at the bottom of 137 to the top of 138. And so I have another question here. And what are your thoughts on the quote, "By learning the laws of science, a person is able to behave effectively under the contingencies of an extraordinarily complex world." And that's also on 138. And again, I'll repost these questions so they'll be easier to be read. He then goes to talk about contingency shaped versus rule-governed behavior, and he kind of talks about how rules can be learned faster because you don't have to go through the whole trial and error process. And this brought me back to the blacksmith and apprentice example, because it took the blacksmith a lot of time to create the most ideal method, whereas the apprentice could have learned the chant overnight. One quote that I thought was really solid on page 39 was at the start of the first real paragraph. "A person who is following directions, taking advice, heeding warnings, or obeying rules or laws does not behave precisely as one who has been directly exposed to the contingencies, because the description of the contingencies is never complete or exact. It is simply simplified in order to be easily taught or understood, and because the supporting contingencies are seldom fully maintained." I thought that this just really sunk in, how people are going to be following directions or listening to you based on how you talk to other people. You just be really conscientious of you don't know how people are going to take what you say to them. But he ends this section, Skinner ends the section with talking about how all behavior is determined directly or indirectly by consequences, and the behaviors of both scientists and non-scientists are shaped by what is really there in different ways. And I thought that was interesting how he connected the scientists and non-scientists. The next section are the rules and the contingencies. This section did confuse me a little bit. I read through it a couple times, and I felt like I was getting lost in circles. So I just wanted to pass the question along to you all. Do you think that, or are the rules in the contingencies? He then goes on to talk more about reason and reasons. And I thought it was interesting how Skinner was talking about we often use reason to describe the consequences of our behavior. And I thought about how often we say, "I went to the grocery store to get groceries," or "I went to Starbucks because I needed coffee." I don't know about any of you, but I definitely use reason, I guess, as a reason to describe my consequences, and I'm definitely going to try to get better at that. Skinner then talked about how it is the consequences that are described or implied in advice, warnings, instructions, and laws that are actually the reasons why a person takes them. So people over time are conditioned by contingencies to listen to others' warnings or advice because depending on what happens, they will be more eager to stop at a stop sign or not run a red light because of things that could happen after. Skinner then breaks down induction and deduction, or inductive and deductive reasoning is kind of how I was thinking of it. But I was struggling a little bit. Induction is reasoning from part to a whole, and he then talks about different areas of the life of reason, like folly and reason, intuition and reason, faith and reason, impulse and deliberation, or invented reasons. Sorry, I know I'm a little bit over time. But I think I am also guilty of the invented reasons. Just reading over, I think there's just some weird things I'm superstitious about, and I just, like putting a book back in the same place. It's like, why? I didn't need to do that. Like, I'm making up this own reason for myself. So I definitely was trying to think more about the intuition, reason, and being deliberate with my actions and not impulsive, because you never know, that cannot be good sometimes. And then just deduction is kind of, it's not necessarily the opposite. Skinner just talks about how it's often a matter of deriving new rules from the old, particularly from a consideration of certain terms such as all, some, no, if, and or. And I was a little bit confused by this, but I think he is just talking about the different ways of breaking down our reasoning. But he ends the chapter talking about truth, and he says no deduction from a rule of law can therefore be absolutely true, and this just kind of left me with a lot of questions. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, what is actually truth? Will we ever be able to know what truth is? And thanks, guys, for bearing with me. I'm sorry I was all over the place. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion. And like I said, I will post the questions. Thank you.